So in today's video, I'm going to talk about sex in ways you've probably never heard before. I'm presenting this as a Christian, but for most of my life, I was definitely not. It's 20 years ago, I started practicing semen retention, which then got me into Advaita, into Taoism, and eventually into Tantra, which is what I started teaching in 2018. So when people ask me whether Christians can or cannot practice or have tantric sex, I'm not just guessing, like I've lived in both worlds. To answer that question, there is a big difference between Tantra with a small t and capital T. Tantra with a small t is what you see, which is probably the Tantra you're most familiar with. It's also called Neo-Tantra, where sex is central, and the goal would be to cultivate intimacy beyond just pleasure through various exercises such as eye gazing, conscious touch, and open communication, and conscious relating. So this is what I would say is I call it the sexualized or aka westernized version of capital T Tantra, also called classical Tantra, where the goal is liberation and enlightenment. Plus it's an entire like Indian spiritual philosophy and esoteric tradition, right? And so you could say that in Neo-Tantra, they essentially try to separate the technique from the theology. And so in that sense, I'd say, yeah, it is safe for Christians to practice Neo-Tantra. However, without a transcendent personal God, things become prone to moral decay. And this is exactly what we see happening in a lot of these circles. And I don't know if this is a good example, but I think it works. It's a bit similar to separating state from church, where you end up with a secular society that also slowly starts disintegrating, becoming more hedonistic, because there is no divine order holding it all together. So earlier this week, I posted a poll asking you guys about this exact thing, right? If Christians can have tantric sex. And the majority of you told me that yes, they can. And when we talk about Neo-Tantra, I would agree with that. But when we talk about actual Tantra with a capital T, we are talking about something completely different. But instead of getting into all kinds of theological arguments about this, I'd rather show you the mechanism behind it and how sex can be used as a technology in Tantra to accomplish its goal, which would be to merge with the divine and to realize that you and me are God, basically. And that's the main theological difference anyway between Tantra and Christianity, where in Christianity, of course, this is not the goal. The goal is to restore intimate relationship with God through Christ, not through sex. And so it's a bottom-up process. When I was in Bali, I briefly spoke to the people behind a documentary called Sex to Spirit. And I'm not saying this to either endorse or denounce the work they did, but because these three words really capture what Tantra really is, sex to spirit. It's a bottom-up process from sex to spirit, from physical to non-physical. So we're basically talking about ascension, right? Whereas in Christianity, it's a top to bottom process, where God descends into creation to meet us basically right here, right now. Saint Ignatius has a beautiful quote about this that says, "God became man so that man could become God." First God with a capital T and the second God with a small t. So meaning man could become like God, restored in his image. So that's an important distinction, of course. Okay, so what does sex has to do with any of this? As many of you know, of course, sexual union goes far beyond just the physical, right? And what happens is that a spiritual dimension opens where the veil between the physical and the non-physical becomes very thin. And so in sexual union, a man and a woman become a vessel through which life can come through from the non-physical into the physical. And so it's fair to say that sex is indeed a very sophisticated technology, right? Yet what happens in Tantra is that it essentially hacks that technology to reverse that downward movement, to go from the physical, to ascend from the physical into the non-physical. And because you're essentially going against God's original design, you also no longer fall under his protection when you do this. And so what that means is that when this spiritual door opens, all kinds of things can come in. Things that were, well, not necessarily invited to the party, let's say. And so it should be obvious that as Christians, you want to, of course, stay as far away from this as possible, no? But to give some credit to Tantra, it is not entirely illogical to conclude that sex could be a path to God, no? Since sex is so transcendent, well, surely it must be a path to God if God is transcendent. But that would be like saying, like, this butter chicken is so amazing. Surely food must be a path to God, no? Of course, food is not a path to God, but it is a gift from God. And so the sex to spirit concept is not entirely illogical, but it is backwards. And to illustrate this, I would show you some of my tarot cards, but I threw them all away. But maybe I can show it in the screen. Imagine you have like the Lover's card. You can have this card straight up, or you can have it pointing down. Same card, but very different meaning, no? And to make this even more complicated, not only do these cards look the same, they also feel the same. And so you can have these two kinds of sex and feel exactly the same. You feel joy, you feel bliss, you feel deep connection, and you feel the transcendence of that experience. And so you might be asking yourself, well, how do I know the difference, no? And for that, we have to look at the fruits that it produces. For example, what does it produce long term? So to me, Tantra offered connection in the short term, but it eventually started to undermine my ability to connect deeply in the long term, because the underlying technique is to dissolve personhood. You want to dissolve personhood in order to see the divine beyond just the person, which sounds great, no? But what you're doing is you're actually just changing your perception, but you're not really changing your heart. You're not cultivating love. You are spiritually bypassing through disassociation. And the same happens with all the other sensations and experiences in Tantra. They are not sustainable because the source is entirely different. In Tantra, you are the source. You have to cultivate, transmute, and maintain. Versus in Christ, God is the source. He's the one who generates, who gives, and who sustains and maintains. In the poll, someone said, well, isn't it all just about intention? And I agree, but intention flows from the theology, and the theology determines the direction. And so to recap, I believe that it is okay for Christians to practice some of these techniques because they are, in essence, neutral. But it's the theological foundation that determines where this is all going. And here's what happens. So you could say that sacred sexuality always starts as a trinity. You have God, you have man, and you have woman. Now imagine my left hand is Christian sex, like the sacred version of it, and then the right hand is tantric sex, being a trinity, right? In the first one, the trinity is maintained because you want to have relationship. And so you want to maintain the distinction between God, man, and woman, where God remains central. This is what I would call union. On the right hand, you have tantric sex, where the goal is not relationship. The goal is for that trinity to collapse into a singularity, where all the distinctions between God, man, and woman disappear, because the goal is oneness. Now, oneness to me is just another word for glorified death. So, because there is no you anymore to observe or experience any of it, right? There's no relationship in that. And so you have life, union, and you have death, oneness. And so the question is, do you want to participate in creation, and do you believe, because you believe that God knew what he was doing, or do you want to undo creation because it was all just maybe one big mistake or one big illusion? Okay guys, if any of this resonated for you, let me know in the comments, and I'm happy to respond to any questions you might have. I know that Tantra is a very big topic, and there's a lot of things I didn't get into today. For example, I know that there is something like dual Shaiva Tantra, and for example, that sex is not the only mechanism in Tantra to reach enlightenment and all of these things. But we can get into that maybe in other videos in the future. Also know that I offer guidance to the men who want to learn how to embrace their desire without shame, but also without being governed by their desire at the same time, so that we can elevate our sex life while honoring and respecting God's original design, so that we can live from spirit to sex instead of sex to spirit. Yeah, thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you next week.